Okay, and then I'll check here and make sure that we're going live according to YouTube. YouTube says yes. Alright, I think we're good. Now I'm just going to pull you up and stare at your face because I'd rather do that than my own. Hey guys, and welcome to Betwixt the Books Discuss. We're doing a live stream discussion to break up the million of book reviews that we have planned because we're gonna do 4 in a row, and that seemed like maybe too many. Too ambitious, too many.
Okay, but it was also 4 planned book reviews in a row, not just us like panicking the day before we're supposed to have Betwixt content going, I guess we'll do a tag. So, I mean, proud of us. But also, like, yay for variety.
Just a little bit. Just mixing it up a little bit. But I mean, this is like, what, like 2 or 3 months of constant Betwixt content. It seems like every other week works good for us with Betwixt stuff.
We can do that.
Good amount. Today we wanted to talk about whether or not we need new adult as a genre. I think my opinion is yes, we do, but let's talk about all of the reasons why I think that we do need new adult as a genre. If you haven't heard of new adult before, because some people may not have, I'm sure most of the booktube people that do booktube know what new adult is, but there might be some folks watching who don't know. According to the Wikipedia page, new adult is a genre where the protagonists are ages 18 up to 30. So the new adults, you turned into an adult. You're no longer a teen anymore. Now you are an adult. And it seems to be basically YA, but for older people. So if you're the same reading level of YA, the same sort of sentence structure or general, like, tropes and stuff that you would find in YA, but just aged up a little bit. So there might be more sex, maybe more violence than you might find in a YA book because it's aimed at adults. But right now, new adult is kind of a pseudo-genre. It's something that, like, the readers sort of talk about, but possibly the publishers talk about a little bit, but it isn't a real genre. Like, you're not going to go into a library and find a new adult genre. You're not going to go into a bookstore and find a new adult genre. It's like a meta genre. It's not out there in the world quite yet.
Like, under the radar. Very... And I think the separate issue with that, too, is that books that might be considered new adult, like, you might find them in romance. You might find them in general adult. You might find them in YA, depending on exactly how they've decided to skew the book. And it means that if it's something that you're looking for, you have to hunt.
Yeah.
And other things cause problems.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of that in general. Because recently, Gretchen and I started reading, and you got recommended a book that, for me, I thought it was an adult book. It was shelved in the YA section of your store, and I think, honestly, it should be a new adult. Like, that's what I think that, having read it, I think that would be a good place for it, because I do think that the characters in it are over 18, at least, so the age bracket works, and also the content of it. I was like, ooh, I don't know if I would put that in YA. And that was one of the things that, like, we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and also semi-recently-ish, maybe not that recent anymore. So as y'all may know, one of my favorite authors is Sarah J. Maas, and she wrote a series, the Court series, which when she put that, like, when she started talking about this book, she was very upfront about saying that it was a new adult book. That it was her, she wanted to write sex scenes, explicit sex scenes, she wanted to write that kind of a romance, but it was also a fantasy. And so she, like, coming out the gate, she said, this is new adult. But publishers, and then because of that, libraries mostly will follow that, put it in teen, because that's where her other series, the Throne of Glass series, was. And as someone who was a bookseller who had recommended Throne of Glass to a lot of people, when this book came out and ended up in the teen section, I was reading it and I was like, there is nothing teen about this. The ages of the characters, the things that they're going through, like this is a romance novel. This is a romance novel and it's in the teen section, and I'm gonna have a parent telling me that I like got their kid like, their 13-year-old tween, and they spent their money on this book that had explicit sex in it. But semi recently, the publisher kind of sent out a mass letter to libraries around the time where they redid the covers, where they were like, hey, we know that we told you to put this in YA,
Don't do it.
but like actually you should move it to adults. And we're all just like, what?
Yeah.
So
went
I mean
to
that
the
was
bookstores as well too. The bookstores got emails and like notifications in our systems of like, don't shelve that there, move it.
yeah, and I mean like this is I can't tell you. I mean it's not necessarily common either at like Barnes and Noble, but this was the first time ever that as working in a library that I had gotten this notification from a publisher. It was really, really bizarre. But overdue.
And there are authors like Shannon McGuire who have pen names. So she writes under herself Shannon McGuire, but she also writes under Mira Grant. And she does that purposely because her books by Mira Grant are more violent. And she doesn't want people who are fans of her books under Shannon McGuire to go read these books thinking that they're going to be the same thing, and they're very different. Shannon McGuire books, while shelved in the adult fantasy section, I think are teen appropriate. Like, you could hand that to a teen. There's not usually sex in them, and if there is violence, it's like no worse than cartoon violence. It's not in gross detail. Whereas her Mira Grant books are like very, very hyper violent, and I would not hand that to a teen. So there's authors who do that too.
In this discussion, we are not like gatekeeping who can and can't read about explicit sex.
Yeah.
But just simply like as a genre definer,
Yeah.
traditionally the inclusion of explicit sex makes it adult. Those lines are getting blurrier, which is kind of where new adult comes up in the discussion. But as we're discussing this and being like, because there's sex, no teen, like for us, that mostly means the genre definition of what is generally considered YA, not like, teens. No.
Yes, like obviously teens mature at different levels, and we're not saying that like 16-year-olds can't read about sex. If you want to read about sex, go for it. And as long as your parents are okay with it, go for it. But it's one of those things where, like, if you keep in mind that what we're told as booksellers, and I believe as librarians as well, is that the YA section is appropriate from, I think, about 12 years old and up. A 12-year-old reading sex scenes is a little bit uncomfortable to me, personally. I'm not going to say no if somebody else says it's okay for their kid, but it's one of those things where, like, I know myself at 12 years old was not ready to read sex scenes. So keep that in mind.
I was in a really, really long car trip with my aunt and my grandmother at the age of 12, and I wouldn't stop talking. So my aunt threw a whole bunch of her books into the back seat with me, and they were all romance novels.
Oh, cool.
So like the reverse thing where like at 12, I was like, this is a really weird way to learn about anatomy.
I did not read a sex scene until high school, so I was a little bit more sheltered there. But keep in mind that, like, both of those were under the okay of our guardians at the time.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, like, a kid picking up a book on a shelf that they think is safe for them because the section is for them, and then suddenly being thrust into something that they're not prepared for.
Yeah. I mean, I think also like the idea of for them though is also where this becomes a really big issue, because there's been a lot of talk in like the industry are people purchasing, like, publishers, editors, agents purchasing YA books with the idea that they will be read by teens, because there's this idea of encroachment into what is like the young adult genre. Because these books are also purchased by people like us who are 20-somethings or, older. And the idea that, a teen doesn't have may not have their own purchasing power. right? But we, as people who make every once in a while money, have our own purchasing power, and so it's a better business bet to buy books that we are more likely to buy rather than teens that actually don't have purchasing power, especially when the people reviewing and blogging and all that kind of stuff are often
Adults.
adults. I was going to say older adults, and then I hurt myself because I realized that I was describing myself with the word older, and now I'm just in pain.
And there's a lot of folks, like, this is not new for the young adult genre. Like, it's not like all of a sudden adults are reading young adult. I'm pretty sure from its, like, I mean, when we were kids, when we were reading young adult as, like, the correct age bracket for a young adult, Twilight was a huge thing, and Twilight Moms was a huge thing. So,
The
like,
Twi Moms.
so, like, it's not new for adults to be reading young adult and enjoying it. Like, that's not new. But it is also something that, you know, you have to think about. Like, it is both meant to be a genre for younger people, for kids. It is supposed to be exploring themes and life points that are for kids in late middle school up through high school. Those themes, like going to college, you know, like your first romance, messing around with, like, romance in general for the first time, because that generally doesn't exist in the children's section in young readers beyond, like, oh, cute, they held hands. And my camera decides to be all fuzzy.
I think with this discussion too, I just love that. And I don't know if you were paraphrasing when you read that to me or if it was the thing that actually was on that Wikipedia article when you were like some of the controversies surrounding new adult, because we actually did pre-work for this discussion, friends. But like Michaela was reading me this Wikipedia article and it was like people think that one of the problems with new adult for this age range for 18 to 25 is that there isn't a market for those kind of books. And I'm like, what? Because again, those books exist.
Yeah.
And people who are 18 to 20, again, have their own purchasing power, are buying books. And so I'm just like, the market exists. It's just whether or not you want to slap a label on it and you think that that is worthwhile is the question. It's not like, you hit 18 and you're like, and now I can't buy another book until I'm 25 years old.
And if you think about it, those books that are like the flagships for new adult, Sarah J. Maas's books, bestsellers. Casey McQuiston was listed on there. I just did a review of her new book, but Red, White, and Royal Blue, bestseller. Like, Jennifer L. Armentrout is a huge bestseller right now. Same thing. Like, all of these books they make money. It's not like people aren't buying them. So that argument doesn't make sense to me. Also because, like, these people are clearly, like, a good chunk of the YA market as well. So maybe they don't want to split the YA market, but at the same time, that's a thing. So one of the discussions that I had seen, I think on TikTok, but maybe on BookTube as well, I feel like Mari Ness might have talked about it, was a discussion of John Green and how John Green became cringy, or his novels became cringy. And one of the things that I said to Gretchen when we were talking about this a second ago was, John Green's books are appropriate for kids. I could hand John Green's books to a 13-year-old and have zero issues with it. Like, it's meant for that age group. It feels young to adults who are reading it, so it might not be appropriate for you, a 27-year-old, but it could totally be appropriate for a 13-year-old, and that's what that genre was at least started as. That's what it was foundationally meant to be for. And so, like, it's one of those things where, like, I don't know, taking a 13-year-old who's a very strong reader into the YA section now, but their parents are like, they're not ready for, sex scenes. They're not ready for that because they're still a kid. Like, I don't know if all of those books are safe for them anymore. Like, it used to be, okay, as long as you're in YA, you're good. There's romance, but there's not, like, explicit sex scenes. There might be some exploration of sexuality, a little bit more than kissing, maybe even, but it's not like a romance book level of sex scene.
I always, every time we have this discussion too about like levels of explicit sex, it always just amazes me because like levels of explicit violence are so
Same
much more
thing.
acceptable earlier on though. Like I feel like more explicit violence entered YA much earlier and people were like, it's a book where they fight the fantasy beasts, so of course there will be slaying. And so I just like it adds nothing to this discussion, but also like the double standard of like this is a really violent book, but as long as there's no sex, like it's fine. Um, but that's not part of the, we can say very firmly, or used to be able to say very firmly that like explicit sex was the line, but like explicit violence is like
Still okay.
shrug. Um,
That might be also because our media has gotten
I mean,
slightly more
yes, but
violent, so like people are a little bit more okay with, like, if you're taking your teenagers to go watch Marvel movies, like,
yeah, like I said, it's not a furthering of this discussion, but like you were talking and I was just like, oh my God,
well,
it's
like,
just
that's one of those things too, right? Like the genre is becoming more and more open to that. And again, no shame, but there are kids who are going to that section because those stories are about kids their age and they want to read about kids their own age, but they're not ready for that stuff.
also the thing. And going back to your point about John Green and like, I mean, I don't know of anyone who would say they were particularly suave in their teen years. Like, right? And so it also reminds me of like all of these TV shows about high school students where they're all being played by like 20 and 30-year-old actors. One, because they're easier to hire, two, because, you can sexualize them easier, like
Yeah.
because you can't. And this, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, and I don't mean to step on a point I know you wanted to make, but the idea of also like as YA gets sexier, it's still technically like people under the age of 18 that people over the age of 18 are reading and just being like, yeah, have sex. And that to me feels
A little
squiffy.
uncomfortable. A little uncomfortable.
Like I'm not, hmm.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the other things that TikTok was talking about was TikTok's language is it spicy? They're looking for spicy romance. But because TikTok feels like YouTube 5 years ago, everybody's reading YA. And so because they're exploring YA, they are also moving into new adult because like Jennifer L. Trout is huge on there.
Hmm.
Sarah J. Maas is huge on there. Colleen Hoover, huge on there. All of those are authors that have explicit, stuff in them and are, I would consider, pretty strongly new adult. It's still one of those things where it's like a lot of the people who are reading these are sexualizing these kids and saying, I wanted it to be spicier. And it's like, it's YA book. If you want a spicier book, go check out the adult romance section because you've got a full plethora of spicy books for you.
This is why I feel like it goes back to like why I would love new adult to be like a legitimate thing because I like how you said this earlier and I don't know if I can paraphrase you there, but like adult, like I like fantasy, right? Love fantasy, but adult fantasy is, I think you said something like it's expected to be more stylistically complex, and I don't have an issue with that. There's a time and place for that. But the reason that I like to read so much YA is because I'm a very speedy plot focused person. And so the thing about many of these lyrically, stylistically complex books is that for me, they're slow. And again, I have enjoyed many of them, but they're not my go to choice. And so I want something with the speedy, like the clip of a YA book, but I want that romance element. And I don't want to feel weird because I want 16-year-olds to kiss.
Yeah.
Like I want there to be an acceptable spice level, but I want that like the the way that you can write a YA book. And again, this is also the reason why YA gets denigrated for being less than because it's not written as well. It's just written differently.
Yeah.
It gives something different to people who don't want to like who can feel like adult fantasy can be a slog. Um, and I want that and I want that to be acceptable so that more people can write that and I can read that and I don't have to hunt through 6 sections of Barnes and Noble or the
Yeah.
library trying to find it. I'm
I had
angry.
I yeah, no. In that discussion I had also discussed how a lot of YA has romance. Like not all of it. There are definitely YA books that aren't romance heavy, but a lot of YA has romance and is science fiction and fantasy and is, other things. It's not just a romance, whereas when you go into the romance section, not all of them, but a lot of them are going to be like 90% romance, 10% plot, whereas some people kind of want 50% romance, 50% plot. But then if you go over to the science fiction and fantasy section, you're going to be finding 90% plot, 10% romance. And the balance there isn't quite the same, whereas in YA, it's like pretty solidly split down the middle, where you get a good solid romance where you get to feel those feelings. And also there's plot going on because they're trying to fight the man or whatever is happening in the book. So, like, that's another reason why new adult would make sense, because you would have that blending of those genres, which doesn't happen so much in the adult section. In the adult section, both of those genres are pretty cut and dry. Like, you need to have these specific things or these specific things, and you can't, like, blend these genres because then it's harder for publishers to market them.
Yeah, and I mean that's why, like, in one way, people have said this about the beginning about young adult, and maybe that's one of the issues with new adult, is that young adult is not a genre.
Yeah.
It is maybe, if you are lucky, a term that suggests perhaps the age of the protagonist, but again is not always true, especially as more like new adulty books go into YA, because you have young adult fantasy, young adult romance, young adult sci, like those are actual genres. Young adult is not a genre, but on the reverse side, calling it something like young adult lets it be, like Michaela was saying, this flexible.
Yeah.
Whereas like there's some really like highfalutin, like, if you are writing high fantasy that is adult, you must, have a map and the hierarchy of the royal family going back 6 generations, or it's not
And at
good
least
enough.
3 languages.
Oh my God. Like, listen, again,
Multiple
there is a
fantasy
time and place for
races.
that. But sometimes just ain't nobody got time for that. Like I just want there to be like dragons and flaming swords and the kissing. Why is that difficult?
Yep, it's one of those things.
Oh,
The other thing that I guess sort of ties into what we were talking about before was that there are genre conventions in young adult. Like, for a while it was you have to have a love triangle. For a while it was, we all must be dystopian. For a while, like, there's trends. YA is very trend focused. And right now, one of those trends, unfortunately, but it is seeming to be a trend, is diversity, whether it be for like LGBTQIA plus people or diversity in the like, here is a book about Muslims, here is a book about Black people, here is a book, like, there's like a diversity as a genre or as a market. And we have read books that were YA that we went, it feels like the publisher or the editor said, this should be a YA book, add these 3 things, now it's YA, and puts it in there. So marginalized groups are sort of being shoehorned into YA, or like aging down their protagonists and sort of slimming down their story or adding in some of those trends, because that's where the publisher thinks those books will sell, whereas they might not market them in the same way if they were in the adult section.
I want to make a distinction here between, like, this idea of like what an adult fantasy book should be is a stylistic convention, whereas these things in YA are market conventions. These are driven by money, not by what makes a good book.
Yeah.
Whereas like in like adult, like these ideas that we have about adult fantasy and science fiction are often like, this is what makes it high literature, and like that's very different.
Yeah.
And I mean, my entire master's thesis was about how using book covers, publishers were othering diverse titles by saying, it doesn't matter whether this is, a fantasy book, a science fiction book, like we're going to market it as it is diverse, which again is wonderful because we need more diverse titles in the market. And if it is a market trend, that means that more people are going to buy more diverse titles. But it's also going back to the fact of people saying, they said that they couldn't publish my book this year because they already published their, Muslim author book for the year. And you want these books to be able to be purchased for what they are, not just because they are diverse. And then being othered on the shelf in a way that is also very focused on, the diverse body and selling that, which is a whole other thing. You want to talk about sexualized women on YA covers? I have a TED Talk, but I'm just saying.
It's one of those things where it's like, they're if we can, some of the things in YA are definitely good, and if we could break that out into more things, like if we could create new adult and help spread that, there's definitely a market for it. It's not that there is not a market for it. There is definitely a market for it. But for whatever reason, people are hesitant to do that. And I think that if YA is meant to be an age bracket, not just of the protagonist, Gretchen got lost again, not just of the protagonists of the book, but also the expected readers. Not saying that only kids can read YA, because that's definitely not what we think. We both read YA books, but one of those things where, like, if that is what it's meant to be, it's meant to be the first steps out of the kids department and into more, slightly more difficult or more challenging themes or whatever else is going on. If that's what YA is meant to be, it's moving away from that now. And because we haven't created new adult, it's making it uncomfortable for me as a bookseller to confidently just bring a 12 or 13-year-old over to that section and say, here, pick something, because this is where you should be. These are the people your age or a little bit older than you that you should be reading, because I can't confidently say to their parent that the content in those books is 100% appropriate for them anymore. And that's a downside to it. That's why we might need this. Also, people would read it. Clearly people want spicy YA books. I think it would make more sense to make those protagonists not teenagers and make them 20-somethings, so that's, legal. It makes sense.
Like, it's much easier to, go off on crazy adventures if you don't have to be home for curfew. That's why so many young adult and even children's books have to, like, get rid of adults in some way. And I mean, also, too, I was just thinking about this when Discord broke. This just happens. We accept this and move on with our lives. I was also wondering, too, because I know when I was a teen, and I obviously love romance elements. I got so sick and tired of the love triangle, but, like, I do enjoy a romance plot. Mm. But I did get to the point, love triangles aside, where I was like, this is not the focus of my life. Like, I'm trying to figure out how to grow as a human being and, figure out, like, friendships and how to, like, grow up. And this constant thing in YA that you have to do that with some kind of romantic interest is just wrong. Whatever your sexuality is, and it is good that more sexualities are being represented in YA, so I'm not saying that should go away, but I am wondering if the addition of a new adult section would maybe take the onus off of YA to so constantly have that romance element that people are looking for, and allow more space for books where that's not like a third to 50% or more of that book. Yeah,
no, I agree that they're definitely, like, romance doesn't need to be as much of a focus for teens, especially because so many of them make it seem like that's their true love forever by the end of it. Mm-hmm. When, like, most of us, the relationships we had in our teenage years are 100% not we're gonna continue going forward. Especially because a lot of those relationships aren't always healthy to begin with, and we've had discussions about this, like,
yeah, if YA had its way, I would have been like, well, I broke up with my first partner, and therefore I am cursed to be alone forever.
I am now a spinster.
Like there's that's it. Because there is no market for 18 to 25-year-old books. You just go from like if you break up with your partner at 18, you're just the old lady knitting your cat sweaters. This is your only option.
The only thing that exists for you. Well, I think that was everything that we wanted to say. We would like to hear your thoughts. Do you think that we need new adult? Are you fine with what YA is doing? Do you think YA fills that niche? Are you one of those people who feels like I do, where it's like the intention of who YA is intended for, the readership is important, or if it's more of just like, oh, these books happen to have teens as the age bracket of the protagonist? Is it just about the protagonists, or is it more than that? Would you read new adult if it came out more solidly? Like if there was a section, would you go browse that personally? Because I feel like I know Gretchen definitely would, and I look at those books as well, although again I'm slightly less on the romance side than she is, but even still. I read the Casey McQuiston book. I just did that review. Please go watch it. It was lovely.
I mean, I'm new to this train, and I don't know. I don't know when it goes off the tracks. Like, it's a new train, and I don't know how long the ticket goes.
Just keep on it.
But, like, I will always love fantasy, though, and I would love new adult fantasy in particular, for sure. So yeah, do comment down below. As normally happens, we also have like 60,000 more thoughts after we turn off the live.
Yeah.
To let us know. We might have, I don't know, we might even decide to contradict our own thought. No one knows.
No one knows. Change is good.
Go ahead.
Taking in new stimuli and making changes based on that is good. I linked down below, I talked about this in my Casey McQuiston review, but I linked down below some resources to learn about residential schools after the news of the 200 plus bodies found at the Kamloops Residential School in Canada last week. So please, if you have not done any research on that, at least like look at those news articles and think about that. There's also resources if you would like to donate to help survivors of residential schools, or just in general learn a little bit about Indigenous history. And that is not solely Canadian Indigenous history, because there were residential schools here in the US as well. So that and many other of the social justice issues that have been going on in the world are linked below if you want to peruse it. But that one I think is important to look at, especially currently. It is the current social justice issue that we need to be thinking about. And I hope you guys all have lovely weeks and lovely lives and are reading good books, whether they be young adult, new adult, regular ass adult, whatever it be. Talk to you again soon. Bye. Stop streaming.